بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to our new course in tafsir. Tafsir is a big deal. It's not a small deal. And I know it seems like it's just a subject, but it's dealing with the subject, which is the Quran. So my approach is going to be a little bit eclectic. So let me take this will be kind of a different style, I think, than all of the other courses that I've recorded. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to spend about 2 or 3 lectures giving you all an introduction into the idea behind tafsir. What is tafsir? And in this introduction, it's really an introduction into the Quran. What is it? When we say the Quran, what do we mean by the Quran? How can we understand it at a macro level? And in doing that, I want to kind of spit out for you, that's a bad word. I want to give to you these broad concepts, like in the concepts of today. I want you to understand that the Quran is a book of guidance. That's one of its main features. I also want you to understand that the Quran is the book from which comes all of the other sciences. And that's another thing that sometimes we forget. All of the things that we're teaching you and all of the things that we're studying together, all of those ulum, all of those sciences come from the Quran with the point of view of understanding the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So these are, for example, some of the themes that I'm going to share with you today. To do this, I'm going to be reading and commenting from a great book by one of my teachers who is currently, at the time of this recording, the Minister of Endowments in Egypt, Dr. Qusama al-Azhari. And his book is translated into English as the Introduction to the Principles of the Quranic Exegesis. Translated from the Arabic by Mustafa Badawi. I couldn't find a PDF to share with you guys, but it's very easy to get this book. Of course, I'm going to be reading the original Arabic and using that, but I just want you to know that this exists as an English translation that is very accessible. So I'm going to go through chapter at a time, basically, until we get to the end. And then when we get to the end of this second or third lecture, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys, every couple lectures, I'm going to select a tafsir, all in Juz Amma. I'm going to select a tafsir and we're going to go with like Tafsir al-Razi for 2 classes, and then we'll skip to another tafsir to give you all a flavor until we finish the 15 lectures. So that's the game plan, not only of today's lecture, but that's the game plan of this course, inshallah. I hope you enjoy it. We'll begin in the next clip, inshallah. All right, so here we begin, inshallah, with our beginning, understanding kind of an introduction to the Quran, an introduction into tafsir. It's really one and the same thing. Of course, the Quran, it's everything, right? It's everything for us. It's the most important thing. It is the basis of our revelation. It is our revelation. And one of the features right off the bat about the Quran that we have to understand is its universality, and it's the fact that it's been preserved. All of the other texts that are considered holy texts, and I don't say this to be negative or disparaging, but they're all limited in time. And they're all what we would refer to as like hadith. Like if you look at the Gospels are really like, they read like hadith. They're accounts about Christ from the disciples and letters and this and that. Very little of it is actual revelation itself. So, and that kind of pattern you find in a lot of the other holy books, where it's clearly put together by people as a documentation of some kind of historical event, and then therefore, by definition, it's very limiting. It's limiting in time and space because it's dealing with something that just happened. Maybe like when you get to the Psalms of David, maybe it's a little bit different because they're like prayers and they're more abstract, but it's very few and far in between. Whereas in the Quran, it's very different. The Quran, once you read it, anywhere that you read the Quran, whatever the sequence of verses are, it's revelation. It's something that is on a macro level, of an absolute level, and it is speaking beyond the confines of the human condition of just space and time. It's valid for all of those things. So off the bat, that's something that is very, very peculiar about the Quran and very, very important to acknowledge and understand. We can think of the Quran, thus explained, as having 4 main functions. It's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but just sort of helps the conversation and the introduction. The first is the Quran is seeking to explain to humanity and help them understand who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. So first tier theological matters, let's call them, is something that is very, very profound in the Quran and very, very clear. All of the verses about Tawheed, Qul huwa Allahu ahad, so on and so forth. Those type of verses, Qul huwa Allah, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard, Allahu la ilaha illa al hayyul qayyum, so on and so forth, that explain and give us an idea of how we should be thinking and understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So part of the Quran is, on a macro level, is to explain the first order theological issues. The second, as I said in the introductory clip, is the Quran is here as a book of guidance. And we'll unpack that. There's a separate chapter on that. We'll unpack that. But it's a book that is meant to guide in a general way and also guide in a specific way. So it guides in a general way because there are verses in the Quran that are addressed to all of humanity. And then it guides in a specific way because, of course, there are verses that are specific to us as believers in the message of the Quran and the religion brought by the Prophet ﷺ, the things that we have to do. So it's a book of guidance. It's also, on the third thing on a macro level, is that the book, the Quran, is a miracle. It is a miraculous text. And it's almost impossible to understand the essence of what that means unless you can get into the Arabic of the Quran and see the a'jaz, see the miraculous nature of the Quran. Of course, there are miracles. The Quran talks about things that were not understood in the past and have come to be understood and will continue to be understood in the future. But I'm not talking really about that. I'm talking about it as a piece of revelation. It is a miracle. It is mu'jaz in its structure, in how the words are put together, the spelling of the words, the order of the verses, all of the particles, everything that's large or small from a language point of view is a miracle in the Quran. And then the fourth function of the Quran is to give us legislation, is to teach us what we're supposed to do, our Sharia and aspects of the Sharia. So as we progress forward, just kind of in the back of your mind thinking about those four large things. Now, when we talk about tafsir, the Sheikh Usama's methodology in this little book is to give you principles of tafsir. Okay, so this is not a book of tafsir. We're going to do that, in either the third or the fourth lecture to the end. Here, he wants you, and I want you to understand the macro approach to tafsir and how its connection to the Quran. One of the most important and significant things about the Quranic revelation is that it's an Arabic revelation and it was sent to the Arabs. And the Arabs were one of the type of people that did not have a book that bound their community like other societies. So other societies, they either had revelation or they had great books. If you think of the Greco-Roman world, their book were the books of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They were recited almost like a liturgical way, frequently performed, quoted. People had memorized parts of it. Like, it's impossible to understand anything about the Greco-Roman world without understanding Homer. Or another way of saying it is, if you study Homer very well, you'll understand everything about the Greco-Roman world. That's their book. It would be very hard for the Quran to then come in Greek or in a Latin. It will almost be vying with that type of work. The Arabs didn't have that. Yes, the Arabs had some poetry in the mu'allaqat, but the Quran is not like the poetry at all. It's completely different. And that's why many of the great poets at the time of the Prophet ﷺ that went to interact with him were kind of like, they were stunned and they didn't necessarily know how to receive it. Well, I've never heard, that's not poetry, but I've never heard that type of language before. So the Arabic language in its kind of virgin manifestation at the time of the advent of Islam, and the fact that there was no significant writing, is what made this the ideal place and geography and circumstance for the Quran to be. Inna anzalnahu Qur'anan Arabiyyan la'allakum ta'qilun. Indeed, we have revealed the Quran in Arabic so that you can understand. So the Arabic language has the capacity of taking this final message and therefore preserving it so that we can understand. And therefore, it because the revelation is so linked to the language, right? You can't really understand the Quran if you don't understand the Arabic of the Quran. Even if your discussion about it is in another language, that's fine, but you have to first understand it in the Arabic language. And therefore, the nature of the revelation of the Quran forced the early generation and every subsequent generation to seek to understand what is the language of this great book, what is the language of this Quran. So, the Quran becomes a catalyst for the formation of an entire intellectual apparatus and an entire thought paradigm that is completely dominated by the book, the Quran, which is our paradigm of Islam. In any expression, Sunni, Shia, whatever the expression is, what I'm saying is of the first order. It's a first principle. It's something that is infused in the entire understanding and consciousness of Islam. The Shaykh, he has a very long quote from Al-Itqan, As-Suyuti's Itqan. Actually, I never looked at the English, but let me just see if it's worth reading to you the English translation of this quote, because it's so impactful. Yeah, okay. I'm actually going to read this entire quote, but I'm going to do that in the second clip, because it's like 3 pages. So the Quran, therefore, makes us want to understand it because it can only be accessed in the Arabic language. So the first major concept of tafsir that I want you to understand is that what is happening through tafsir is we are trying to create systems of learning and understanding, i.e. sciences, to understand the Quran, and therefore there will be different types of tafsir. So there's not one type of tafsir. There's going to be a tafsir that's an extension of the quote that I'm about to read for you in the beginning of the next clip. So we can come at the Quran from different angles, from a different perspective, if you will, and continually to draw meanings. And the most important thing about that is that something that happened in the past kind of stopped, but something that should not stop. So one of the points of us doing it and teaching it this way is that we must continue to develop systems of understanding to be able to, and sciences to be able to understand the Quran. I'll begin the next clip, inshallah, by reading you that long quote from As-Suyuti's Itqan about this point. Okay, let me read you this long quote from As-Suyuti's Itqan, Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran, one of the great books about the Quran. I mean, probably one of the greatest. Anyway, about the kind of emergence of different sciences that the Quran inspired the emergence of these different sciences so that the Quran could be understood. So he says, Imam As-Suyuti says, radiyallahu anhu, the Itqan. Ibn Abi al-Fadl Al-Mursi says in his tafsir, the Quran contains the sciences of the ancients amongst humans as well as the latecomers, so that in reality its meaning is known only to him who revealed it, and then to the Messenger of God, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, save for what God, transcendent and exalted is He, has kept for Himself. Then the majority of the leading companions inherited this from him, such as the 4 caliphs, Ibn Mas'ud, Ibn Abbas, who was able to say, were I to lose the hobble of my camel, I would be able to find it through the book of God, exalted is He. That's how much they depended on the Quran, that even the most mundane thing in their day-to-day life, they would be able to find it and meaning of that issue in the Quran. That's how close they were to the Quran. Then it was inherited by those who followed with excellence. But then resolution faltered, knowledge rescinded, and scholars became too feeble to carry the burden of its sciences and various arts that the companions and followers had carried. Therefore, they separated these sciences into distinct specialities, each group concentrating on one speciality. One group concerned itself with linguistics, semantics, counting the letters and investigating their pronunciation, counting the words, the verbs, the surahs, the hizbs, the nifs, the arba', the different way we demark the Quran. The number of prostrations, marking at the end of each 10 verses, counting the number of times a given word is repeated and the number of similar verses. This was done without delving into its meanings or meditation on its content. They were called the qurra', the reciters. Right? So he's saying, this quote, that Suyuti is bringing is that the early two or three generations, all of these things that we're about to talk about was already naturally in their heads and in their hearts. That's how they interacted with the Quran. But that became difficult to sustain because it's impossible that each generation can have that. So now he's going to show you how people split off in different expertise. The first expertise are the reciters, those who master the things how it's written, how it's ordered, the number of verses, the number of prostrations, etc. He continues. Grammarians concentrated on the grammatical analysis of nouns, verbs, and articles, the a'rab of the Quran. They discussed at length the nouns and their derivatives and the various kinds of verbs. Some made extensive analysis of ambiguous expressions, while others analyzed it word by word. Exegetes, the Mufassirun, concentrated on the expressions used, finding that the same word may either mean the same thing every time or two or more different things. Therefore, they left the first as it is, strove to explain what was not obvious, and discussed the probabilities for deciding in favor of one meaning and not another for words with two or more meanings. Usulis, or principle experts, concentrated on the rational proofs, axiomatic principles, and deductive arguments, as Allah Ta'ala says, had there been many gods, they would have been corrupted, quoting the Quran. And other such verses, from which they draw their proofs of God's oneness, affirming His existence, pre-existence, and subsistence, power and knowledge, and negating anything that is not becoming of Him. They are called the science of usul al-din, the science, aqidah. Another group studied the meanings of the discourse and saw that some of it was general and some of it was particular. They derived from it the rules of categorizing what is literal and what is figurative, what is specific, what is general, and the matters in which information is conveyed, explicit declarations, synthetic statements, clear as opposed to ambiguous passages, commands and prohibitions, abrogations, and the various kinds of analogical reasoning. This is called the science of usul al-fiqh. Yet another group studied what it made licit and what it made illicit, as well as all its other legal rulings. They derived principal rules from which secondary ones branched off, and they are called ilm al-furu'. This is the science of fiqh. Another group studied the narratives concerned with the ancient past and gone by communities and extracted their stories. They call this al-qasas, or history, a narrative. Others studied the maxims, which are formulations of succinct wisdom, the analogical content, and the sermons that are to shake human hearts and are almost capable of pulverizing mountains. They concentrated on their promises and threats, warnings and good tidings, the mention of death and resurrection, the mustering and the judgment, heaven and hell. These were made into sermons and admonitions, and those who delivered them were called orators or preachers, al-wa'adh. Others concentrated on the verses regulating inheritance, detailing shares and defining deserving recipients. This was called ilm al-fara'id, or the science of inheritance. They derived from it the division of shares into halves, thirds, quarters, sixths, eighths, how to calculate who deserves what, and the rules of testaments, or the bequests, al-wasaya. Others examined the verses pointing out the cosmic marvel in God's creation, the succession of night and day, the movements of the sun and the phases of the moon and the stars and the constellations. From this came ilm al-mawaqit, or the science of timekeeping, and all of the kind of astronomical phenomena of the sighting of the moon and the angles of the moon. All of that's kind of in the mawaqit subsciences. Writers and poets studies its literary excellence, fluency, harmonious succession of ideas, preambles and conclusions, variations in styles, prolixity at certain times and concision at others. From this they derive the science of style and figurative expression. And the people of subtle indications and inward realities perceived fine meanings to which they gave definitions so as to form a technical vocabulary, compromising terms such as extinction and subsistence, presence, fear and awe, intimacy, estrangement, consternation, contraction, and expansion, and so on. Of course, the science of tasawwuf. These are all the various arts that the Muslim community derived from the Quran. Okay, so in this long quote from As-Suyuti's Itqan, you can see that basically the Quran, and this is just kind of a summary, but the Quran inspired all of that. So what we come to study today, fiqh, usul al-fiqh, mantiq, nahw, sarf, balagha, urud, hadith, mustalah, etc., 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 tasawwuf, usul al-din, usul al-fiqh, etc., all of these things come from the Quran. And sometimes, because of where we are in time, we forget that. We just, I don't know, we just assume it, or we just, maybe you didn't forget it, but sometimes it happened to me when I was, on my pathway to studying. You forget that all of these are nothing but tools to service on our understanding of the Quran. So the Quran is the greatest inspiration for our entire intellectual apparatus. It is the heart, the beating heart, with its twin, of course, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is the heart of our thought paradigm. And therefore, because of the power of it being the final message, the only preserved message, the message that is outside of its human circumstance of time and place, and etc., it pushed people, Arabs and non-Arabs, to develop these sciences and others to be able to comprehend and understand the book. So the inventing of sciences is not something that is artificial, but it's something that was inside the early generation. They naturally understood these things from the Quran. But as he said, with the progression of time, there was a need to articulate them and to codify them. And that is a process should not stop. It's something that should continue. So if we find ourselves sluggish in that area, then that's something that we, as people that are taking this course of study, that's something that we need in the back of our minds to be thinking about. What other things do I need to develop? What other tools, what other sciences and disciplines do I need to develop to be able to understand the Quran for myself, and for those around us, so that we can do our job of preserving the Quran. Now, not all of the disciplines and sciences that we find are important. One of the quotes that he has, Sheikh Osama, in the introduction, is he talks about mythology. There's no mythology. The ulama didn't use mythology to understand the Quran because it's not relevant to the Quran. But something like timekeeping and astronomy, that's something that's a good example, where it's not on face value it's not a stereotypical Sharia science, but it's something that's very important because وَبِالنَّجْمِ هُمْ يَهْتَدُونَ, Allah says, by the stars they are guided. And of course, we can only determine the beginning and the ends of the months by the sighting of the new moon. And our liturgical calendar, the calendar of Islam, the lunar calendar, our liturgical calendar, is something that is directly connected to that observation. Well, related to that are going to be things like pollution, light pollution, northerly latitudes, southerly latitudes. I'm just giving you an example. So therefore, when you start to expand out, you need a lot of things to be able to understand the Quran. Okay, let me pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so the Quran is the great inspiration for the creation of the different sciences. The next chapter, or the next principle of tafsir, is understanding that one of the main and the chief functions of the Quran is that it is a book of guidance. Now, when we say that the Quran is a book of guidance, when we come to look at the verses that talk about hidayah, about guidance, one of the things that's clear is that absolute guidance is something that only belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إِنَّكَ لَا تَهْدِي مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهُ يَهْدِي مَنْ يَشَاءُ. You cannot, Allah addressing the Prophet ﷺ, you cannot guide the person whom you want, only Allah can guide whom He wants. So therefore, Allah Ta'ala ascribes to Himself guidance in the absolute sense as something only belonging to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yet hidayah or guidance is also used in the Quran by the meaning to explain or to make clear or to invite. For example, Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, this is in Surah Ash-Shura, verse 52, وَإِنَّكَ لَتَهْدِي إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. Indeed, you call or you guide to the straight path. So, in this way, we have an obligation, aided by the Quran, aided by the revelation, to call and to make clear our way and our values and our principles and what we stand for. And in that sense, in which Allah Ta'ala has linked that with some type of human agency, there are two types of that type of guidance. Remember, absolute guidance, that's with Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. So belief itself, as we say, belief qua belief, you know, absolute hidayah only belongs to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. If anyone could guide anybody, the Prophet ﷺ would have guided those whom he wanted to at his time. So this verse is addressing that. So therefore, we even are more far removed from that, having that ability. But guidance in the second kind, which is to call, to make clear our path, that's also of a general and a specific kind. In the general case, we have something interesting in the Quran, that there are many verses that are addressed to humanity. Ya ayyuhan nas, for example, Ya bani Adam. Well, those are verses that are addressed to everybody. And then we have another set of verses, Ya ayyuhal ladina amanu, O you who believe. So the Ya ayyuhal ladina amanu, we're going to find usually those type of verses are addressing some kind of Sharia practice or belief that we have to do. But Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'ila lita'arafu inna akramakum 'indallahi atqakum inna Allaha 'alimun khabir. That verse, for example, which is kind of in Surah Al-Hujurat, like the rallying of how we deal with other people, this is addressed to everyone. Allah Ta'ala is saying, O people, we created you from a single male and female, but we divided you into different nations and tribes so that you can know one another. So the diversity for us in the creation is linked to this idea of the general guidance. So this is profound. So I want you to follow. I feel like I'm giving a khutbah, not teaching a class, but I mean, it's just profound stuff. So what we're saying is that because of the structure of this type of guidance, if you follow the scheme that he's laid out so far, there's absolute guidance, and then there's guidance that's linked to human agency. Guidance that's linked to human agency, if it's of two kinds, general and specific. If you think about the general type of guidance, like this verse, Ya ayyuhan nas, O mankind, we created you from a single male and female and divided you into nations and tribes so that you can know one another. Therefore, the diversity of the human condition triggers in us the need to know one another, to benefit from one another. In other words, when it comes to our human affairs, it might be that another people's way of thinking and way of organizing and way of doing something and way of solving problems will be better for our current circumstances than the way we've been doing it. Think of something like the Battle of the Ditch, where the Arabs didn't know about ditch building as a trench warfare. That kind of wasn't a thing. But Salman al-Farisi, radiallahu anhu, because he came from Persia and he was old by the time he met the Prophet. He had lived already like 2 lives, and he lived like a whole third life with Rasulullah as one of the great companions, radiallahu anhu. He had a solution. So it doesn't mean that Islam is deficient, but this is the Quran inviting us to learn from other people and other people learning from us. So for us, when we think of the book of guidance, when we think of the Quran as a book of guidance, when it comes to the human part of the guidance, the one that we have human agency in, therefore what we are saying is that part of this guidance is we have to learn from one another. That's how we call to the straight path. Because there are things that are going to unite all of humanity. Just think of like a neighborhood. Let me give you like a very silly, artificial example. Say we live in a neighborhood that has 10 homes, and 2 homes are Christians, 2 are Jews, 2 are Muslims, 2 are Shinto, 2 are Hindu or Buddhist or something like that. I mean, just totally making it up. And it starts raining really bad, and there's like a flood, okay, and it's in the neighborhood. Isn't that a communal problem? Okay, there's nothing to do about how I pray and how you pray and how she prays or fasts or my belief about this or eternality, reincarnation, not reincarnation. All that doesn't matter. What matters right now is we got a problem that is affecting all of us. So what's the best way to solve the problem? So we have, maybe a meeting with a neighborhood meeting, and we come up with a couple of solutions, and boom, okay, this solution is going to work. We execute it, and alhamdulillah, we solve the problem. Very generic, simple, silly example. But that's exactly what the Quran is telling us, but on a massive international communal level, is that when we see people of other faiths, other beliefs, other ways, that triggers in us, therefore, great, I want to know, what is it about, what's the rhyme and reason there? And then that person I should have also the opportunity to share my rhyme and reason. That's what da'wah is. Da'wah is not knocking on the door and have you heard the good news. I get very annoyed when Muslims think that da'wah is Islam is an evangelical religion, often a proselytizing religion, because many Orientalists say that, but that's not true. It's not proselytizing in that way. It's in this way, in the sense that it's a guidance, and we'll call people to guidance because we might have something that will benefit them. As for absolute guidance, belief and non-belief, only Allah can do that. I can't affect that. You can't affect that. إِنَّكَ لَا تَهْدِي مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ. You cannot guide the person whom you want. So sometimes we as Muslims ourselves, we get caught up with the two. So the second, principle of tafsir is to understand that the Quran is a book of guidance along the ways that we have kind of explained thus far. Anything else I want to say about this? Okay, I only really prepared these two chapters. I don't have time to get into the next chapter. But let me just pause, since I have a couple of minutes, to say that what I'm after here, and why I think this book is very good, other than the fact that Sheikh Osama is my teacher, and I have oodles of respect for him, even though he's just a couple years older than me, but he's light years ahead of me in knowledge, is that I think that when I read this book, it was very beneficial for me to get excited about the idea of tafsir. Because to be honest with you, tafsir is not something that I never typically go to. If I need something, I'm going to go in usul or fiqh. If I need to know the meaning of a specific verse, I'm going to go to tafsir. The first tafsir we're going to do is we're going to do Imam al-Razi's, because that's my go-to tafsir. And as a Shafi'i, probably that would be most Shafi'i's go-to tafsir. But I'm going to give you different flavors. I have some on my shelf, so I'll give you different flavors. We have a Mu'tazilite tafsir, we have a Sufi tafsir, hadith-based tafsir. So I'll get into that in the other lectures. But the ocean of tafsir doesn't make sense, I think, unless you have something like this that guides you, to get you excited about how impactful the Quran is and how it relates to all of the other sciences. Because when you find these different tafsir, you are going to see that they're going to come at the tafsir from a different vantage point. Even somebody like al-Razi, who is a faqih, he's also an usuli, and he's also a mutakallim. So depending on the verses, he comes at it from those different angles in the same book. So you'll have different flavors as well. But all of that's not going to make sense unless you have these principles are very, very important. So this is a very useful book, and that's why we're going to spend the next couple lectures doing it. And I hope you find it as beneficial as I did. That's it for the first lecture. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, this was our first lecture in the subject of tafsir. And what I'm doing is, as a recap, is I'm going through this book by Dr. Osama al-Sayyid al-Azhari, The Principles of Tafsir, The Principles of Quranic Exegesis. I always have difficulties pronouncing that word, which is a translation of Al-Madkhal ila Usul al-Tafsir, that he wrote. I think actually even wrote this before he did his PhD. Anyway, the approach of the book is to give you a high-level macro view of those principles of how you understand the Quran. So today we talked about two main principles. The first principle we talked about is the relationship of the Quran to all of the sciences, the Islamic sciences or the rational sciences that we use to understand the Islamic sciences. That the Quran has been the greatest catalyst and the greatest motivation for people to develop these sciences, to bring them outside of what was intrinsically understood in the early generation, for them to bring it outside and to codify it, so that we have these organized ways of understanding the Quran. So this is the first major principle that we talked about. And therefore, that's a process that happened in the past, kind of slowed down in the late couple last centuries, but should be something that continues, because as the human condition continues, we require new tools to understand the Quran. So let us be the generation that starts to do that. The second principle is to see that ultimately the Quran is a book of guidance. We talked about guidance being absolute guidance that only belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for someone to believe or not to believe. But then there is guidance, as we read in the verse, is to guide to the path, to provide guidance and to provide clarity. That is of a general kind and of a specific kind. The specific kind are like the verses, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, things like that. The general kinds are like Ya ayyuha nas or Ya bani Adam. And those verses teach us, therefore, that part of the guidance is us coexisting with other people and benefiting from what other people have to, how they solve certain human problems and how we might even solve certain human problems ourselves. So those are the main principles we talked about in the class. Like I said, just to repeat, maybe 2 more lectures like this of the introductory book, and then I'm going to give you guys a flavor every 2 or 3 lectures. We'll stick with one tafsir for 2 or 3 lectures, all in Juz Amma, inshallah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.